IELTS Writing Task 1, Lesson 2, Line Graphs. Line graphs show numbers changing over a period of time. So you will always see numbers on the left on the y-axis and time on the bottom on the x-axis. And the lines on the graph show the numbers changing, going up and down as the time goes on. One thing you need to know before we start: you will not see a graph with only one line in your IELTS test. A graph like this would be too easy. You will almost definitely see 2, 3, 4 or even 5 lines on the line graph. Usually the most common are graphs with 3 or 4 lines. And your job is to compare the lines, not to describe them separately. Do not write a separate paragraph about each of the lines. Make sure you compare them. And there's 2 types of comparison that you need to make. First, make a very general comparison of the lines on the graph, the information. This is for your summary or overview paragraph. I do this after the introduction as paragraph 2, but you could put the summary at the end. An example of this, if we take a graph with 4 lines, the overall summary would be something very, very general, like saying that the blue line is the highest overall, is higher than the other lines overall, in the whole period shown. Very, very general. Second, compare the lines at specific points. This is for your details paragraphs, paragraphs 3 and 4. Looking again at the graph for an example, with these 4 lines there are many details that you could compare. I would start off at the beginning with the first year and compare the numbers there, but then there are many other choices and you have to select what you think are the main things. You might choose this point where the blue line becomes the highest and stays the highest for the rest of the period. You might choose to describe and compare the different increases or rises. You might choose the peaks on one or more of the lines. You might choose a stable period on one of the lines like this one. There are many things to say and you can't describe everything, so you have to select. My tip is write at least one thing about each line. Make sure you do some comparisons, and if you've got 1 or 2 things that you've said about each line, that should be okay. With that advice in mind, let's look at a line graph question now. Here's the question. The graph below shows electricity production in terawatt hours in France between 1980 and 2012. That's the question statement. Then we look at the graph itself. You can see the heading at the top, electricity production in France by source, TWH. TWH must mean terawatt hours. We can see that from the question. You don't need to understand what that means. Just use terawatt hours as your units in your report. You can see on the graph, on the y-axis on the left, those units 0 to 500, those are the terawatt hours. So if we're talking about 500, we'll say 500 terawatt hours of electricity. At the bottom on the x-axis you can see the years 1980 to 2012, and in the box in the middle of the graph we can see the sources of electricity: thermal, nuclear, hydroelectric and renewables. How then do we write a report about this? Well, if you watched my previous lesson you'll know that I have a 4-paragraph structure: introduction, overview or summary, details, details. You can put the overview at the end if you want, but I prefer it second because it's quite important. Starting then with the introduction, we paraphrase the question. We just change some words. So the main thing to look at is the question statement here. The graph below shows electricity production in terawatt hours in France between 1980 and 2012, and we're going to just try and change a few words in there. We start with the graph below shows, and we can change that to the line graph compares. Then electricity production, we can change that to the amount of electricity produced. I'll miss out in terawatt hours. We don't really need that. The next part is in France, which can stay the same, in France. Now I'm going to add something. I'm going to add those sources where the electricity comes from. We can see in the graph those 4 sources. I'm going to put those in my introduction, using 4 different sources of power. And finally, we need to get the dates between 1980 and 2012. A nice way to change that is talking about the length of the period, over a period of 32 years. The full introduction is finished then. The line graph compares the amount of electricity produced in France using 4 different sources of power over a period of 32 years. Now we can move on to paragraph 2, the overview. 2 sentences, 2 main points. We're looking for some very general information on the graph. Let's look at the graph again. And the most general thing that I can see, the main point, is that the orange line for nuclear is definitely the highest over almost the whole period. We'll talk about that. And one more thing, let's just go to the opposite. The renewables are the lowest figures in the whole of the graph, the whole of the period. Let's write up in 2 sentences those 2 main points. First sentence about nuclear power being the highest. It is clear that nuclear power was by far the most important means of electricity generation over the period shown. Notice that I've made it a bit nicer than just saying nuclear power was the highest. I've said most important means of electricity generation. That's a good phrase. The second sentence was going to be about the renewables being the lowest. Renewables provided the lowest amount of electricity in each year. And that's my overview finished. 2 paragraphs done. Now we're ready to move on to the details paragraphs. 2 paragraphs, paragraphs 3 and 4, in which we compare the lines in more detail at specific points. We need to look at the graph again and decide what to put in paragraph 3 first of all. I always begin at the beginning with the first year, so I'm going to compare the 4 numbers in 1980, and then I'm just going to move on to this one point in 1981 when nuclear power becomes the most important, the highest for the rest of the period. That's all I'm going to put in paragraph 3. So here's my paragraph for paragraph 3. I wrote 3 sentences and I started with the first year, as I said, and the highest number. In 1980, thermal power stations were the main source of electricity in France, generating around 120 terawatt hours of power. That's the highest number in the first year. Then moving on, we add a comparison with the other 3 sources. Nuclear and hydroelectric power stations produced just under 75 terawatt hours of electricity each, and renewables provided a negligible amount. Negligible means very low, almost nothing. So I've taken 1980 and mentioned all 4 sources of power. Now I just want to add one more sentence about the year 1981. Just 1 year later, nuclear power overtook thermal power as the primary source of electricity. Overtook means it went above. That's paragraph 3 finished. Before we continue with paragraph 4, one important tip when describing numbers. You can't write nuclear was 75 terawatt hours of electricity, and you can't write nuclear produced 75 terawatt hours of electricity. It doesn't make sense just to use the word nuclear and the verb like that. You need to think carefully and don't just use the word you can take from the graph. You might need to change it. Here's what you should write. Nuclear power was used to produce 75 terawatt hours of electricity, or nuclear power stations produced 75 terawatt hours of electricity. So it's the power stations that produce the electricity, not just the word nuclear. Be very careful with the subjects that you use, especially when just taking the word from the graph. Look at this slide carefully and think about that point. People lose marks by doing this wrongly. Okay, on to paragraph 4. Let's go back to the graph and look at what we are going to select for paragraph 4. Remember, we can just take at least one thing about each line. Starting with the nuclear line, I'll just take this increase up to a peak in 2005. And I'll contrast that with the thermal line, the red line, where we had a decrease down from its high point at the beginning. For the blue line, we're just going to say it's fairly stable for most of the period, or all of the period even. And for the green line, we'll just talk about this increase at the end. So we've got one thing about each line, and we'll try and make sure that we compare or contrast when describing those numbers. Let's see what I wrote for paragraph 4 then. Again, another 3 sentences. First, between 1980 and 2005, electricity production from nuclear power rose dramatically to a peak of 430 terawatt hours. That's my sentence about nuclear. I'm going to contrast that now with the thermal power. By contrast, the figure for thermal power fell to only 50 terawatt hours in 1985 and remained at this level for the rest of the period. Next, hydroelectric power generation remained relatively stable at between 50 and 80 terawatt hours for the whole 32-year period. But renewable electricity production saw only a small rise to approximately 25 terawatt hours by 2012. That's paragraph 4 finished, and we finished the whole report. It's done. Remember, there is no conclusion in writing task 1. We've already done a summary. You can put the summary at the end if you want, but write in summary, don't write in conclusion. To finish this lesson, let's look at the good vocabulary that I've used in that report. We'll look at the examples of paraphrasing and comparing language and describing changes that I used. We'll start with paraphrasing of electricity production that came from the question. Instead of electricity production, I wrote amount of electricity produced, source of electricity, provided electricity, generating electricity. I also used the word power instead of electricity all the time. Also, means of electricity generation. Instead of the years between and or from and to 1980 and 2012, I wrote over a period of, or over the period shown. Those are good phrases to use for the years. Next, by far the most important. That's a good phrase, by far the most, by far the highest number. I often use that phrase in my overview paragraph to summarize. Next phrase, a negligible amount. That was a good phrase to learn, meaning very low, almost nothing, not noticeable. Nuclear power overtook thermal power. When I said it went above, it went past as the most important source. As the primary source of electricity, primary source is good, that means it's the main one. Rose dramatically to a peak of. When you're describing lines on a graph, you're going to use this increase and decrease language. By contrast, we did some comparing. The figure 4, instead of always saying the amount of electricity produced repeated many times, you can just say the figure for nuclear power or the figure for thermal power. Remained at this level, remained stable. That was another description of the trend. And saw only a small rise. It's nice to use the verb see in this way. You can say nuclear power saw a rapid increase or dramatic increase, but renewables saw only a small rise. You can do this with countries as well. The UK saw an increase in something. So that's the good vocabulary that you should have a look at when you print the worksheet next to this lesson. You can print the worksheet, watch the lesson again, and analyse each sentence carefully. There are some tasks on the worksheet as well that will help you focus on vocabulary and the structure, the linking, the comparing language that I used. So have a look at that worksheet and watch the video again. In the next lesson, we'll do a similar thing for a bar chart question.